Hi, everybody. Hi. Okay, so I know there's some people seem to say there were some complications last time logging on. I think it's hopefully going to be quicker and smoother this time. Welcome to everybody. You can introduce yourself in the chat if you want to at any point. You can ask questions in the chat at any point if you'd like to. But we're going to begin shortly. Just as now at 8 o'clock, I think we'll just wait a minute or two, just maybe 1 minute, just to let some people join. Who said they'll be like a minute late or so, and then we'll actually begin action. Okay, so again, just a tiny recap of the first, what we covered in the first section, but this stands alone. The first section, we looked at the very early parts of the Haggadah, and we spoke about the fact that what the four sons tells us is that really all of us have different elements within us, and we're trying to evoke the curiosity. That's the key. The whole opening part of Haggadah is to tell you that it doesn't matter how much you know, there's so much to learn and so much to experience. And that's where we left off. And it's to open us up, because the night is not about reading a text and getting information. It's about so much more than that. So let's begin with the very next moment of the Haggadah. The Haggadah seems to jump back in time. Once upon a time, our ancestors were idol worshippers, and now God's brought us near. And we think, why are we jumping back 4 centuries before anything happened in Egypt? Why does the Haggadah feel the need to take us back in time even further than just start from we were slaves and we became free? And the answer is as follows. It's really the title of this talk, because you could have a really enormous question. You could have a question that in theory could undermine the entire premise, the entire basis of everything we do on Seder night. Everything we do on Seder night from beginning to end is themed around Hashem took us out of Egypt. Thank you. Right? We're going to, starting from the beginning all the way through to singing Dayenu. It's amazing how much we want to thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. It's all very nice, however, you could ask, that Hashem took us out of Egypt. But who got us stuck in there in the first place? What's the great news in thanking God for taking us out of the problem when God got us stuck in there in the first place? So you might think to say like this, no, theologically, what we believe is God leaves the world, lets human free will take over, and human free will people decided to enslave us. And you know what? But then God saw the injustice, came into the world and saved us. That's nice, but it's not what the Haggadah believes, and it's not what the Torah says either. How do we know? Because centuries earlier, centuries before we went down to Egypt, God is in dialogue with Abraham, and God says to Abraham, and the Haggadah quotes it. He said, I promise you your children will inherit this land. And God says, how do I know? And he says, you'll know, because your children will be slaves in a land that is not theirs. They'll be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they'll be enslaved and afflicted. And it'll take 400 years into the future until they come out with great wealth, and the nation that afflicts them I'll judge. So 1 second, that means that going into Egypt was the plan. God promised Abraham, you're going to go into Egypt, you're going to become enslaved, you're going to have afflictions, and then I'll take you out. So if that's the case, then the Haggadah itself is telling you, and the Torah is telling you, that this isn't we got stuck in Egypt, someone enslaved us, God saved us. God himself drove us into Egypt. It was part of his plan that we should be enslaved, should be afflicted. Why? And then why would we thank him on the other side? If somebody comes along, hits you in the face, knocks you on the floor, then they come lift you up again, throws another punch and blocks it just in time. Would you say thank you? And maybe you say thank you and then hope they go away or something. But you wouldn't feel you owe them gratitude. So if God says, I put you in Egypt, I enslaved you, then what's the sense of gratitude on the other side? That's what you could ask. And the Haggadah is acutely aware that could be a real knockout question. And so it tells us the story does not begin in Egypt. The story begins hundreds of years before Egypt. God and Abraham are in dialogue. God says to Abraham, you're going to have children. Abraham says to God, he believes him. The Torah says it was a wonderful thing. Yachshavel tzedakah was considered wonderful. Then God says you're going to inherit the land. Your descendants will inherit Israel. And to that, Abraham asked what seems to be the most bizarre question. He says, Hashem, God, how do I know that they'll inherit it? And you sit and you think, 1 second, because the infinite creator of the universe has just told you? Like, what greater, what could you want more than that? Can I please have some? Imagine God comes in right now, starts a conversation with you and tells you that this coronavirus is going to be over in 2 weeks or 2 years. Fine. If God told you that, that's pretty much the best proof you can have. If God says your children will inherit the land of Israel, that's the best proof you can get. I mean, what are you going to ask for more? That he shows you a vision of the future? How do you know that's accurate? Yeah, what sort of question is it? God, how do I know? And Rashi, the primary biblical commentator, gives an answer. You know what he says? He says, maybe they'll sin. In other words, God, the land of Israel is supposed to be something that ultimately is deserved. Ultimately, it must be about the merit of the people in the long run. Short run maybe can have political power, but in the long run, it's about the merit. And if that's true, that it's a land you earn through free will, then I've got a problem. You can't promise me my children will have it unless you're promising me that they will not have free will. In other words, if the purpose of life is to use free will, make the right choice, it means that so long as they have free will, they could also make the wrong choice. But then you can't promise me that they'll end up with the land. How can you guarantee they're going to end up making the right choice? Either you're telling me they don't have free will, in which case, what's the point of life? Or you're telling me they do have free will, in which case they might mess up. You cannot promise me they have free will and they will succeed and inherit the land. And to that, God says, he makes Abram take some animal things and he basically puts them into a vision and he says, look, either through the offerings in the temple or perhaps even through the exiles, there'll always be a way. They may mess up, your children, but there'll be a way to operate. If gangrene sets in, if the spiritual rot sets in, we'll always be able to operate and save them. But Avram's worried, but 1 second, but that's true if you give gangrene in the finger or something, you could always amputate it. But if you've got problems in the heart or the brain until the age of transplants, what can you do? And for that, on that point, God says, don't worry. I'm going to put them into Egypt, take them out the other side. And when they come out, there will be something so good. Yes, it will be able to mess up. Yes, individuals down the ages will be able to get things wrong. But the core will be so beautiful and pure and holy that it will not be possible that they will mess up, that the core of the Jewish people mess up. In other words, something will be created in Egypt that is so connected to God that even if lots of individuals mess up, the essence of Israel will make it through history. How does that work? Well, the Haggadah says, let's go back to the ancestral generation. Abram and Sarah achieved tremendous heights. They have between them, Abraham ends up with 9 different children, at least that are listed in the Torah, but only one, only one follows his pathway, Isaac, Yitzchak. Yitzchak marries Rivka, they have children, only one follows their pathway. In other words, continuity is very tenuous. Along comes the 3rd generation, Yaakov, Rachel, Leah, Jacob, Rachel, and Leah. They have a whole family. And here, for the first time, every single member of that family stays committed to their pathway. There may be problems, tensions in the family, but the one thing that's there now is a family, something that can continue them, be part of their continuity. In other words, there is, if you like, a conceptual, cultural, or spiritual equivalent of a gene, something that can be passed on hereditarily from generation to generation. And then Yaakov von of Yehuda Mitzrayim, that gene, that seed is then taken and planted in Egypt. And then what happens? And by the way, we say, it's this that guaranteed Jewish survival throughout the history. How? Why? What happened? Well, the next thing the Haggadah does is it quotes 4 biblical verses, and most of the long part of Seder night is an analysis of these verses. And they're the verses taken from when any farmer in biblical times or in temple times would have their first fruit. They would come to Jerusalem and quickly, instead of thanking Hashem just for the fruit, for the very existence of the Jewish people, the nation of Israel. And he would start with 4 verses. And the first one says, my ancestors were crushed in Egypt. So they entered Egypt and they grew like a seed, like a plant. And the principle is this: if you take a seed and plant it in the ground, the first thing that happens is it begins to look like it's rotting and decomposing. That's what it does. And you look at it and you think the whole thing's falling apart. It's going to soon stop existing. If you'd never seen a seed before, you would think it's rotting, it's decaying, there's no future here. And as everything's being stripped away from it, that's essentially what was happening to Israel in Egypt. You see, in Egypt, they lost any geopolitical capacity to exist as a nation. There was no such thing as a nation at that point in history, anywhere between the 15th to 12th centuries BCE, that ever emerged. There were people who went into Egypt, there was nobody who came out. If you were enslaved in Egypt, you were not going to come out as an independent people. Perhaps eventually there'd be an emancipation of slaves, and then you'd be regular Egyptians, but you could not. It was not possible that you would actually emerge from Egypt as an independent entity, as something that wasn't geopolitically plausible. Under the laws that govern human interaction, sociology, anthropology, or anything else like that, you were never going to make it out of Egypt. But more profoundly, in the rabbinic eye, in the eye of the Talmudic rabbis and the Midrashic rabbis, more profoundly, even spiritually, you could not possibly have made it out of Egypt. In the level to which, if you like, angels could detect your spiritual value, you were not different to the Egyptian. You could not have succeeded in exiting and making it out of Egypt. In fact, so much so, the Talmud puts it very sharply. It said that a week later, after they've come out of Egypt, they're standing at the sea, the Yam Suf, the Reed Sea, and the Egyptians are pursuing them, and in the end, the sea will split. But before that moment, God says to his angels in the Talmud, it says that he says to angels, split the sea. And the angel turns to God and says, why? What's the difference between one and the other? And you think, what do the rabbis of the Talmud mean exactly? Well, you think angels would argue with God, whatever that means. Until we realize that in Judaism, when we talk about an angel, we don't mean a little being looks like a baby flapping around with wings. We mean a malach, a messengery device, some kind of messengery device. That's what we mean. That's what we refer to. The equivalent in modern, if we wanted to use a modern metaphor, we'd say something like an algorithm, a piece of programming, a conscious piece, a spiritual piece, but a piece of programming nonetheless. And these programs are saying to God, we cannot detect. We're programmed to distinguish on spiritual merit, or moral merit. We cannot find a distinguishing feature. We cannot locate a spiritual difference between Israel and Egypt at this moment, even a week after the Exodus. And what that means is that we lost any spiritual right to exist. So physically, we have no ground upon which our existence can happen. Spiritually, we have no ground upon which our existence can happen. All of that was stripped away from us. And the seed in the ground is rotting and decaying. And that's the second verse. The first verse we read is the seeds planted in Egypt. It starts to grow. The second verse we read talks about how we were afflicted and oppressed and all but destroyed, until at that key moment when all hope is lost. Naturally, we can't exist. Supernaturally, we can't exist. Kabbalistically, they talk about us being on the 49th level of spiritual impurity. When all seems like it's lost, there's only one hope. That little gene, the seed is rotting, that little gene kicks into action and it starts to grow. And that little ancestral gene that we had going back all those centuries, in the Haggada's language, we cried out to Hashem, God of our ancestors. You know what we said? God, we don't want to exist based on the natural forces. We don't even want to exist based on the supernatural forces. We want our existence to be completely based on you who are above the natural and the supernatural laws. We want to be based on our commitment to you. And do you understand how radical that is? What's being said here in the language of the Maharal is that what comes out of Egypt is not like every other nation on this planet, plus we're going to get a Torah. No. What's created in Egypt is a group that cannot exist in the way that others can. Won't have the type of history that a normal people will. Won't live with the comfort zones that other nations will be able to. Will not sit easily in this world, to borrow the phrase of Matthew Arnold, that great British writer who says, the Jew, ironically, of course, the Jew is terribly ill at ease in Zion. The Jew doesn't seem to fit very well in this world. That's what's created in Egypt, a people who don't sit well in the world the way it is now, a people who dream of it being different, crave for it to be different, will fight with everything they can to make sure this world will one day be different. That's what's created in Egypt, a people whose very existence is to dream God's dream, share God's vision, and then re-enters the world on that basis. That's the principle that's being given to us over here. In other words, when everything else, God says to Abram, you realize what happens? You have tremendous geopolitical capacity to exist. You've got wealth. You've got a whole movement around you. You've even got a little militia going on over there. Yes, you're respected. You control some of the central wells and important resources in your time. So yes, if somebody had to predict, will you exist? there's a high probability you're going to exist yourself. Spiritually, supernaturally, you've got all the merit in the world. You're Mr. Kind, and you and your wife, tent open to everybody. You've got all the merit in the world too. But I want to take all that away from your children. And do you know what will happen when I do that? When they're crushed in Egypt, something will come out that you have that you don't realize you have. A gene, a power, a prayer, something that says, God, we're willing to have nothing but you. Base our existence not on the angels, not on the natural world, but on you. And when that happens, something will be created that will be able to last all the way through history, through every challenge that's ever thrown at them. Yes, they'll have a rocky history, highs and lows like no other nation, but they will last, and they will eventually bring merit to the world and get the land of Israel. That's what the Haggadah is telling us happens in Egypt. At least that's part one. Okay, but then there's a fourth verse. And the fourth verse speaks about how God responded to that. And this is perhaps the most remarkable verse. I don't want to say the most remarkable in the Torah, because every verse you could say is remarkable, but an incredibly remarkable verse. It says the following. Sounds very simple at first, quite innocent, and very what you'd expect from our God. It says, and God took us out of Egypt with a strong hand, B'yad chazaka, B'zrona too, with an outstretched arm, with great awesomeness, with signs, with wonders. And the Haggadah starts interpreting this verse. Yeah, this refers to this plague, or that one, or this sign, or that sign. And then the Haggadah says something else. It says, Dovracha, another interpretation. And this is where it will bring in the 10 plagues. And by the way, you could try this out at home. You can try this with any of your friends. You know, in the middle of that Haggadah, at a certain point, we clearly arrive at the 10 plagues. You ask anybody, how did we get here? We were just in the middle of some funny discussion, and the 10 plagues appear. How did they get it? And the answer is that the Haggadah does an analysis of this fourth verse. And it suddenly hears, 1 second, strong hand, that's 2 words, outstretched arm 2, great awesomeness 2, signs 2, wonders 2, that equals 10. These are the 10 plagues, and here they are. And you think, 1 second, whoa, what was all that? No, B'yad chazaka, with a strong hand 2. What do you mean? What it means is like this. If we talk about the hand of God, that's clearly one aspect of God's revelation. If we add the adjective that it's a strong hand, that's clearly 2 aspects of God's revelation. Okay? Outstretched, an arm of God, that's clearly a metaphor or language for another aspect. Outstretched, that's another, so that's 4 so far. Great awesomeness, that's 6, right? Signs must be plural, that's another 2, that's 8. Wonders, that's another 2, that's 10. These are the 10 plagues God brought in Egypt, and here are they. And you sit there and scratch your head and go, 1 second. If the Torah was trying to tell us that there were 10 plagues in Egypt, why couldn't it have just said, God took us out of Egypt with 10 plagues? Why does he say he took us out with a strong, that's one aspect, hand, that's another, outstretched arm, and we squeeze till eventually we discover there's 10 different terms. If the Haggadah wanted to say, the Torah wanted to say that God took us out with 10 plagues, it could have said so. Why does it do it in such an obscure manner, in such a bizarre and strange way? And I think the answer is as follows. I heard this once, a very deep idea. Had the Haggadah just said, and had the Torah just said, and God took us out of Egypt with 10 plagues, you know what you'd have learned? You go around the Seder night table, or if you're alone for Seder night, call people in advance and ask them this question. What do you think the most important lesson of the 10 plagues is? I think some people will say God's power. Some people will say, in the end, evil gets destroyed. Some people might say, justice is done. Some people might say, it pays to have faith in God. There's all sorts of things people might say, and they're probably all right. They're probably all true. They're great lessons for the whole year, but they're not the lesson of Seder night. You see, the overt meaning of the verse is not talking about 10 plagues. The overt meaning of the verse is God took us out with a strong and outstretched arm, great awesomeness, signs and wonders. If you just ask somebody, what does that verse mean? They mean there was miracles. It was great revelation of God. And hidden within that are 10 different terms which hint to you that there's 10 plagues. In other words, the Haggadah doesn't want to say God took us out with 10 plagues. It wants to say God took us out with awesomeness, with revelation, and that revelation happens to manifest in 10 plagues. Why? Why is that so important? Because the only lesson we should be learning on the 10 plagues is this, is that in the end, all of the limitations of the natural world are there in the short term. But in the long term, they can all be overturned. If you can connect to the creator of all of reality, then nothing in reality ever has to be a long-term limit. Let me explain. Many are the sources that point out the parallel between these 10 plagues and the 10 utterances that God used to bring the world into creation. In the creation chapter, the verb used most often is not God created, not even that he made or formed, it's God spoke. God said, let there be light. And many to God says, let there be a firmament. God says, let there be dry land. God says this, God says that, God says the other. God speaks and the world comes into being. The world is, if you like, God talking to us. And the rabbis say there were 10 different speech acts, starting from the word Bereshis, there's a beginning, moving on to light and land and plant life, the atmosphere through which we could see the sun and the moon and the stars, and the animal life, and coming from the water, the oceans, and the terrestrial animal life, and human dominance over the species, the image of God, all this kind of stuff. And in 10 plagues in Egypt, all that was destroyed. And there's different views of this, but a common strand in some Hasidic sources, for example, in the Sfas Emes, but also in some of the Lithuanian Kabbalistic school sources, Rav Yitzchak Isaac Choves, to say this, that actually the decreation, if you like, it's a decreation process. It's working in inverse. It's rolling backwards through the creation chapter, so that the last thing created is the first thing destroyed in Egypt. Why? Because if you imagine that God creates a world with a set of laws, natural laws, humanity with a set of forces that govern. And what happens is that in Egypt, it's the human superpower, the pinnacle of civilization up till that point in history. But in Egypt, they followed the pagan world, which was all about power and dominance. It was about, it was very common, not just of Egypt, but many civilizations, to believe that might actually defined right. So, for example, to the Greeks, centuries later, Alexander the Great, when he hits the gates of India, suddenly becomes divine. Why? Because if you're that powerful, the gods are on your side. And the gods themselves are fighting each other. The world ran on power. That's why in the ancient world, it's almost all about militarism. The expansion of cities into empires was always about military conquest. Even human agglomerations were so often about military, the worship of warriorship and warfare. Children who were disabled were very often killed in many ancient societies. Most societies believed that if somebody was born poor, they were meant to be poor. All this kind of thinking is ancient Egypt. And God says, I look at this and it's like a contamination of the laws of creation. It's taking all the laws of creation and manipulating them. And Egypt believed in a one word, ma'at. Ma'at meant order. The order. They controlled the flow of the Nile in case it overflowed with channels. They ran the agricultural system and its surplus. They controlled which animals you can and can't have. There was incredible order, and the pharaoh was responsible for holding ma'at, order in the world. But part of that order included that if a bunch of strangers turned up, they were enslaved, placed under control. And God says, you've taken every aspect of creation. You've creatively built with it, but you've built a society that's built on power, dominance, control, all these kind of things that are repugnant. And so I'm going to tear away, if you imagine creation as concentric circles, right, from an inner circle of Bereshis, there should be a beginning to let there be light and outwards. I'm going to tear away one layer at a time until eventually I rip away all the laws. Now, if you think about this for a moment, and you think about the parallel between the creation chapter and the 10 plagues, so I never saw this exactly inside anywhere, anyone who works out all 10 of them, but here's a hypothesis. The very last thing in creation is what God says, you should be fruitful and multiply, and mankind, I want you to produce life and dominate the earth. And the very first plague takes human life, the source of human life, water, and turns it into a symbol of death, blood. The second last thing in creation, we're going in reverse order. So the second last thing in creation is where God says, you're going to be above that. The animals will be afraid of you. And from the plague of frogs, no longer is the animal afraid of man. It's undone. The state of man is undone. The third last act of creation, where God says, let us make man in our image. And in the second chapter, you discover this act of somehow taking mud, and eventually if it becomes a human, there's a medrash that says it goes through the form of many animals, but ultimately, we're built of the mud of the earth. Every cell in our body is a piece of animal or vegetable we ate. The animals themselves are vegetables reconstituted. The vegetables are just mud reconstituted. We are mud taken, and we produce the human being. And undoing that, in the third plague, Moses told, take the mud of the earth, take the sand of the earth, throw it upwards, and it becomes the plague of lice that attacks man. So instead of man being produced by the mother earth, man is now attacked by the mother earth. And that's so it rolls backwards. The fourth last thing in creation is where God differentiates the animals according to separate species, while the fourth plague is Orov, where the species mix up and suddenly the boundaries between the predator and the cattle are reversed with tremendous losses to human lives, to the animal livestock. Before then in creation, God produces animal life starting from the sea. And the fifth plague is where God actually kills the animals. They die from plague. Before then in creation, God says, let there be the sun revealed on earth. And Rashi says, the commentary says, brings healing to man. And instead, Moshe in this plague throws the things up to the mud up to the soot up to there, and it comes boiling down in blisters. And now the sun attacks man. So everything is inverting the process of creation. The act of creation before that is plant life. Now the hailstorm comes down and destroys plant life. The act of creation before that is when a 2-day process, God creates a habitat for man. And the next plague is the destruction of the habitat of man, the locust. In that act of creation, it says, God says, I reveal dry land. And in the plague of locusts, the eye of the world is covered. Then comes that second moment of creation. God said, let there be light. And the second last plague, darkness. And by the way, to the Egyptians, that would have had an incredibly powerful meaning. Because in Egypt, at that phase in history, top of their list of the gods is a god named Ra, the sun god. And if you notice, in fact, all the plagues are moving from underground all the way to ground level, upwards and upwards and upwards. So the first plague strikes the water, the next strikes the frog and moves from water to land. Then it's on land with the dust becoming lice. Then it's the animals that are being attacked. Then it's a man. And then it starts to move upwards towards the sky as the locust, the hail and the locust. And then it moves all the way up until the sun itself is blotted out. There's darkness. And to the Egyptians, the symbolism would have been incredible, that even their belief in the sun god, well, this God who's doing these plagues is more powerful than all of that. So darkness undoes the second saying of creation, let there be light. It's all gone. And finally, we come to that moment of midnight in Egypt, that moment where the word Bereshis, let there be the beginning. And every Rashis, every creative beginning in every family is destroyed. And it's like God says, I've ripped away all the laws now. There's no laws that limit you. There's no laws that govern you. You're now free. You're free to be mine. You're free to dream my dream for the world. You're free not to be limited by creation. You're free to become a people whose very existence is not based on the way the world is, not based on its power structures, not based on the vision of human power or any other form, but based on what's godly, what's good, what's beautiful, what's holy in the world. That's who you're going to be. And because your very existence is that commitment and that dream and that vision, that can never be shaken and never taken away. And no matter what happens when you're placed back in the world, you, the people that are created, will be a people who never feel they quite belong in the world the way the world is. You're a people who will belong to its future, citizens of what we call Olam Haba. Olam Haba, the world as it will be in the future. Citizens who will not be comfortable, who don't feel at home until it's a world where there is no more war and there is no more hatred and there is no more self-centeredness and it's all godliness. That's the world we're citizens of. That's the world that we are temporary residents in a world that is not like that. But the real freedom then is the capacity to live with the dream of the future and be citizens of that future. And that's what's created in Egypt. And so the question is, why do we need to go into Egypt in the first place? The answer was to rip away the attachment to accepting the world the way the world is, to rip away comfort with the way the world is, to feel intensely uncomfortable in a world where people can oppress each other, where a society could kill children, where people could impose inequality, where they could have all the hierarchies of antiquity, kill the disabled children, concentrate education to minor group of people, or whatever it may be. All that's taken away, and all that's left in its place is a people whose very essence and very existence is and will always be the creator of the universe, who is free. The creator of the universe who can freely dream of a different world, and we will not feel we may be temporarily limited by the way the world is, but not permanently limited by it. And that's a huge part of what the Haggadah is doing. I'm going to pause here because I want to give an opportunity for questions or comments to appear in the chat. And I'll happily take on the half-hour mark. This is a perfect moment to turn to your questions and anything you have on this or on anything else related to it. And what I've learned in the last few of these lives is there seems to be a bit of a delay between me saying that and somebody actually posting up there. But feel free and invited now if there's questions that you have on anything I've been saying or points that require some clarity. I'll just sum up very briefly where we're at this particular moment. We started by asking the question, why does that God decide to go back in time, to Abraham? In the beginning, our ancestors were pagans, and then God drew us near. And the answer is because you could have an enormous question on the whole Seder night. That's what we said. We said you could ask, it's all very nice that God took us out of Egypt, but who got us stuck in there in the first place? It was God. It's explicitly that God says, look, this was God's plan to put us into Egypt. Why was that? Why did God promise Abraham that he's going to put us into Egypt? And the answer we said following the Maharal of Prague is because God wanted us to lose every natural capacity for existence. He wanted us to lose every spiritual capacity for existence. He wanted to force us to bring out an ancestral gene that would say, when we're completely crushed and there's no hope, God, there's one hope, you. We want to be your people in this world. We want to be a people who live for your vision, dream your dream, care about what you care about, want what you want for the world. That's the basis and the fabric of our essence and our existence. And when God had taken everything away in Egypt, that was the voice that came out. And then we point out that's actually the three of the verses of the farmer's first fruit declaration, which forms the main core of the Haggadah. Hashem, we went down to Egypt and became a growing nation there, and then we were crushed and almost destroyed, and then we cried out to Hashem, and God saw all the pain. And then that fourth verse, God took us out of Egypt with a strong hand, outstretched arm, great awesomeness, signs and wonders. And we point in that, God points out there's 10 different terms used in that, or hinted at in that verse. Those are the 10 plagues. Why can't we just say God took us out with 10 plagues? Because we don't want, if you just think about 10 plagues, you think about evil gets destroyed or things like that. Great lessons. But the only lesson that God wants is the natural meaning of the verse. There was awesome revelation. There was a sense that the natural can be overridden. And what we pointed out is the 10 plagues, the 10 utterances that God uses in creation, beginning, let there be light, let there be this, let there be the other, are all undone in inverse order in Egypt. So that's the summary. And the point of that is that God's saying to us, Egypt was the power structure of the world, the power center of the world. It had taken all the 10 laws of creation and contaminated them, all of them. And here God says, therefore, I, one by one, in reverse order, go through a decreation, undo the laws that dominate the world, and then I produce you, Israel. So you're created as B'ni B'chor Yisrael, my firstborn, as my own child and ambassador in this world, not limited by all those laws of creation, not limited by the Ma'at order of ancient Egypt, not limited by that, but free to dream, citizens of its future, the future of humanity, who by existing in the present with the law of the future are able to eventually challenge humanity through generation after generation, bringing it ever closer to the final vision. So that's where I'm pausing and offering you questions which you can put in the chat, questions or comments or anything like that. I'll take a moment to see if there's any questions that do appear here. If not, then I'll move a little bit further. Because actually, if you think about it, the whole of Seder night, let's go back to something we said last time, is about time travel. Next time we're together with the beginning next week, I'll show you how the matzah morrow actually helps you on this time travel journey. But right from the beginning of the night, we started on a moment of time travel. We said this is the bread that our ancestors ate in Egypt, when the only night they ate that bread in Egypt, matzah, was the last night of Egypt. That was the only time that we read of in the Torah. They may have done it every other day. And then we start the declaration that the Jews would have done in Egypt. This year, we are here. Next year, we hope to be in Israel. This year, we are slaves. Next year, we're going to be free. And what we're saying is, we do not just commemorate Egypt. What we're doing is much more profound. We are reliving that last night. We're reliving that moment where God lifts us and says, you're welcome to come to me. Your cry has penetrated my ears, so to speak. I'm ready to bring you to me if you're ready to become a people who will not be comfortable in the world the way the world is, but will dream my dream for the world. If you're ready to have that, and we literally sit there experiencing those moments, experiencing that final meal in Egypt, except that when we become free in Egypt, what we really do, you see, in Egypt, when they were lifted into a moment of freedom, they had a vision of the future. We'll talk about it more next time, but they had a vision of the future, and we say it in the Haggadah, and they saw that they will have future generations that will come after them and keep this vision alive. In other words, we go on Seder night and we celebrate them. They were sitting there on Seder night celebrating us. And that's how we bring the whole thing together. It's so that we sit there going back in time to their final night when they were being lifted and shown by God what the end of history could be like and everything in between. And so on the one hand, we travel backwards, on the other hand, we travel forwards. And with it all, we attach ourselves to that incredible vision that underlay the call for freedom in Egypt, that vision that could only come about because of the crushedness of Egypt. And now let me add one more point. In about the 18th century, a number of schools of thought, the Hasidic world, the Lithuanian world, emerged and, drawing on a Kabbalistic concept, did something very radical to the whole of Torah interpretation. The radical idea was this. They said every time that we talk in the Torah about the national, something national that happens to the whole people of Israel, or a national thing that the whole nation of Israel should keep, it also refracts down to every individual too. And so if every Seder night we have a national celebration of coming out of Egypt and the national birth of the Jewish people, and then it actually also refracts down to individuals. Each of us individually has an experience parallel to Egypt. Something that limits us, something that holds us back, something that makes us feel small in this world or incapable in this world or unable to achieve really great things and godly things in this world. The Hebrew word, as the Degel Machane Ephraim says, Mitzrayim, which means Egypt, can also spell the word Mitzarim, constriction and limitation. And just as on that night, the power was there for the people to say, God, we want your dream and vision. We want to be free of all the limits. So too, that applies to every single one of us individually. Of course, primarily it's national. Primarily our relationship with God is not individual, but collective. It's only together as families, as communities, as an entire nation that we can have that. But it begins in the individual as well. And by the way, this year, there will be many people who, like the Jews of Egypt, will be in their own homes, and many people whose entire Seder night will be individual. And for many, that's a worrying thought. But actually, whilst, of course, it's not the easiest way of doing Seder, there's something very beautiful and special about sitting there on Seder night, where we're the child and God is the parent. And this about ourselves discovering our own freedom, which will then allow us, to tap into the whole national freedom that's going on. But the key to freedom in the Seder night then is to realize that we do not need to be attached to the world the way the world is now. We can attach ourselves to the creator of the world who can, does, and will recreate the world all the time. And so the 10 utterances of creation are undone in the 10 plagues. And then at Mount Sinai, there is a recreation. Instead of 10 laws of the natural world, we have the 10 commandments. Instead of the 10 utterances of the natural world, they have been destroyed in Egypt. The limitations of them are destroyed in Egypt. We have the 10 utterances of the vision of the moral and spiritual world, the constitution of the way the world will be. And that replaces the natural laws. Yes, in the short run, you're always limited by power. But in the long run, the only limit is how great your ideas are, how godly they are. The more they're attached to reality, the more they're attached to godliness, the more free you are to ultimately help recreate the world, and the more they will come to fruition. So that's it from me. I'm going to wait again to see if there's any questions that you want to ask in the chat. With pleasure, I've got another few more minutes here that I'm happy to stay on and answer questions if there are any. But other than that, I hope this has been of insight and of value and helped us understand at least the structure of the journey. So in the first week, we looked at the whole opening part of Haggadah, which is to prepare us, to open us, come with questions, come on a quest. And the next part of Haggadah says, actually, you know what that first Seder night was? It wasn't a night of information. It was a journey where we can quest. It was the journey to come to God with our vision and what we most deeply seek in the world, and the ability to attach ourselves to the creator of that world and then live in this world as temporary residents whose citizenship is the dreams that will please God come true. That's true nationally, that's true individually, and that's the journey that Haggadah takes us on. Of course, that's not the end of the journey. The Haggadah is still going to take all of that and say, well, one second, what's that got to do with the food that we're eating? What's the matzah? What's the maror? How does all this work? How's the meal itself radically transformed? And then how are we meant to use that to actually achieve all these heights that we're discussing here? But that's going to be our next talk. For now, I hope this has been of tremendous value to everybody, and you should have a wonderful preparation for Pesach and a wonderful, uplifting, liberating, personally, family, and nationally Seder night and Pesach. We'll meet again hopefully next week. Thank you very much.